and start the recording. And I'm going to turn it over to our friend Christian to get us started.
Thanks, Philip. So my name is Christian Pritchett. I'm the Director of Development for Blue Line Development. I'm lucky enough to be one of the people that was involved with this project from its very conceptual beginnings. As a project, Arroyo Village ultimately ended up as a 130-unit, 4% plus Colorado state tax credit bond deal, along with 11,300 square feet of shelter space for the Delores project. That's where we ended up, but it was quite the process to get to that final product. I was just looking at my records the other day for this project, and I ran my first two models on this deal in September of 2014. And at the time, I ran a 42-unit model and a 120-unit model using both 9% and 4% credits, state credits, whole bunch of different financing sources. And from that time until we ended up with the concept that we settled on, I think I ran 55 or 60 different unit mixes and conceptual models. And there was a reason for that. You know, at the time, even before Blue Line got involved, Dick Taft and Terrell Curtis with Rocky Mountain Communities and the Delores project got together because they each owned half of a city block. And on the Rocky Mountain side, they had 27 units of existing affordable housing that were part of a larger scattered site 4% deal that was in its extended use period. The buildings were in bad need of some redevelopment and a lot of love. On the Delores side, they had crammed themselves into an 8,000 square foot building that was formerly a daycare and really wasn't doing them justice for the programs that they wanted to operate and the people that they wanted to serve. So Dick and Terrell got together at the time and said, you know, we both own half of this city block. What can we do here to address each of our respective needs? This was in the summer of 2014, and around that same time is when Zoe LeBeau started up the Pathways Home Affordable Housing Toolkit, and Dick and Terrell formed up as a team to participate in that toolkit, which is how Blue Line got involved. I distinctly remember sitting down with Dick and Terrell in Chapa's building in September of 2014 and really trying to identify the problem that we needed to solve, which was how do we serve three distinct populations on two sites that are zoned differently, that are owned by different organizations that currently have existing buildings on them, 5 existing buildings, 3 of which are under a land use restrictive covenant that we needed to unwind. And how do we do all of this in the most impactful way that we can? You know, how do we have the biggest impact that we can for the affordable housing crisis and homeless crisis that existed in the city of Denver and still continues to exist to this day? That was the problem that we had to solve, and we were really fortunate to be involved in that conversation and go through a ton of different models, both financing and unit mix, to figure out what made the most sense with the resources that were available at the time, the zoning that was in place, and ultimately, and most importantly, considering the population that we were trying to serve, the 3 populations that we were trying to serve. It wasn't a quick process by any means. We did have to go through a rezone on the Delores side. It was originally a PUD that the city of Denver helped us rezone to a GMU5 to match up with the Rocky Mountain Community side. We worked very closely with CHAFA. We actually went through 2 different application rounds for the 4+ state credits. And we actually went in on the award, we went in with a very different financing model than what we ended up with. We were originally considering a HUD model with a cash collateralized bond structure. And what we ultimately ended up with was very different from that. We ended up going with a Freddie Mac TEL perm loan structure and layering in literally 10 different sources of financing along the way to really make this project whole. It was quite the process, and we were lucky to work with some really sophisticated and intelligent financing partners to help us through this process. You can see all the different sources of funding that we had on the screen right now. And at the same time, you know, we're still solving an extremely complicated entitlement issue of how do we serve these three distinct populations within one building, and how do we do so in a way that is meaningful, is articulate, and really makes operational sense. We debated a lot internally as a team before we finally got a recommendation from a partner at the time that said, you guys really ought to talk to this guy named Chad Holzinger at Shopworks. You know, they're fairly new, but he's really innovative, and I think he could solve your problem. So we sent out an RFP for architects and interviewed Chad, and he came in with a site plan that none of us could have even conceptualized at the time. He came in, showed us the site plan, and said, I think this is how you need to do it. And oh, by the way, I think we can do this while leaving the Delores project current operations in place so that we don't have to disrupt the guests of the homeless shelter. We ultimately ended up not doing that. We relocated them twice throughout the construction process, but we were really struck by Chad's innovation and his ability to come in and solve the site planning and entitlement process. So he's gonna come in next and talk about what that process looked like and how we ultimately ended up with the final product. But before we do that, we'll take a quick pause to answer any questions about the history of how we got to where we are.
I don't have any questions in the chat yet, so I'm going to let you guys go ahead and continue. And if somebody does think of something, we can always circle back to it at the end.
Cool. Everyone here, out there? Well, I'm Chad Holzinger with Shopworks Architecture, and thank God we didn't try to live through the construction process at the shelter, because as it turns out, what I thought was a genius idea at the very beginning, you know, I remember walking through the site with Icota, who was building the project, and a couple of the architects from our office, and we looked at each other and like, this would have been a complete impossibility. There was a mound of dirt that was about 35 feet tall and dust everywhere, and I just can't imagine all these homeless women and construction workers and dust and diesel coexisting happily for, you know, 15 months or 18. But this is a picture of the site. This is kind of where it started, and you can see that it's really a beautiful part of the neighborhood. Knox Court, 13th Avenue. It's right on the light rail station at 12th and Knox Court. In a neighborhood adjacent to all kinds of parks and the Lakewood Gulch green belt that goes right in the Platte River, right into downtown. So really rich site. And what we were trying to do is solve 3 projects, as Christian said, but I really think of it as 5 projects. There was a public works utility relocation in the form of a public sanitary sewer as a project. And then there was the 27 feet of grade across the site. So it was really like a grading and site planning project. So on top of a shelter for women and transgender individuals and supportive housing and workforce housing, it had all this other stuff too. And so the entitlement and the conception of all of this, recognizing that we were working under financial constraints and timelines and such, was kind of fun to think about. I mean, abstractly, it sounds like a great project, and then working on it actually was pretty fun too. The shelter consists of 60 beds, which you can see the dorms in the upper left, kitchen, dining, and kind of social rooms, which are down in the purple. And then there's some staff offices and intake offices and staff break rooms. That was kind of the programmatic elements of the shelter. And as we were starting the design, we were really struck with, well, what does this project want to be, and what's kind of its spirit and its purpose? And so we messed around with initially this idea of, it's like Arroyo Village. It's down by Lakewood Gulch, and it connects into the Platte River and part of that. And so we were thinking, well, maybe that's a way to abstract kind of this engineered base and then kind of an image of the building architecturally. And we also wanted to ensure that the courtyard, that there was a safe place for all of the residents of the community, but we didn't even know what that meant yet. We just had this hunch that being on the light rail with noise, being on this Knox Court, which is actually a fairly busy street, that there was this element of inside and outside, and keeping the residents of the community well cared for and protected from the external environments. And to do it in an interesting and humane scale, even though the building's really like 6 stories tall, for the purposes of code, it's 4, but grading. This is kind of our first try at like what the shelter might look like. Each programmatic element had its own discrete entrance. So the shelter, we really wanted to make sure that that was a discrete entrance, that it didn't scream out to the world shelter. And for safety reasons of the guests, actually, we intentionally kind of tucked it around the corner on a I don't know, a need to know basis only, I guess. Whereas the PSH entrance and the workforce entrance were right away facing. I'm running 2 computers, so excuse me. This is you can kind of see the beginnings of the workforce entrance and the supportive housing entrance, which are on the north side. And then always mindful of the context. This site is one of the best sites in Denver, I think. It's just a really amazing place for housing because of the multi-modes of transit into town. On a bike, it's like 6 minutes from Auraria campus and the Cherry Creek Path. So all kinds of employment and services and access are available, and including recreation. I mean, the park across the street just got a total overhaul, and it's got the coolest play structure maybe in the country. As we navigated the process, and we made many blunders along the way, what we were learning is that designing for the women of the shelter and the families of workforce and the individuals in the supportive units, that, you know, I had a genius idea one time, like maybe there would be a way to overlap the shelter guests and the resident and the families. And I was pretty quickly told that that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of, because that can be triggering to certain individuals. And maybe instead, why don't we figure out a softer touch of courtyard and have maybe visual sight lines that are discrete, so that you can access that if you choose, but that it's not forced upon you. And so the design of the courtyard, you know, from a diagram standpoint, a C-shaped building, nice courtyard. Well, all of a sudden now we have 3 courtyards with visual access and opportunities and things like that. And how do we do that in a way that recognizes an individual's preferences without making it feel institutional? And so the work of that really became a substantial part of the narrative of the project. All of this, ironically, was made possible by the tremendous amount of grade on the site. So you can see this cross section where the the shelter on the north enjoys kind of a perch, and then there's like steps and terraces and meanders down into the courtyard, which allowed us to set this tone of separation, even though it's all one community. I think Laura had in her notes that the shelter took 1 day to flatten, and I think that's a real testament to Ikota's big old thing right there. There it was. This was right after the beginning of construction, looking up the hill at the back of that piece of equipment. All of this initial research turned into an awakening, at least in my professional life, of trying to figure out what the built environment and mental health and community intersection looks like, and how to define that. And so we attended a workshop put on by SAMHSA, which is the Federal Mental Health Agency. And it was a workshop given to the Delores Project on trauma-informed care. And in that work session, they were talking about the growth of the human mind and what happens to the physiological conditions in the brain when individuals are exposed to extreme stress for a period of time, and essentially the neurological patterns cease to develop. Which leads to a whole bunch of stuff. And we've done a ton of research along those lines. Really, as a function of completing this project, it really kind of opened those doors. So we did a bunch of site tours around buildings that had opened recently within the region, conducting focus groups within those buildings. These are supportive housing buildings primarily, some public housing. But we were asking both residents and operators about how's living in supportive housing, and we conducted a bunch of surveys too to really hear what's working, what's not working, why, what's safety mean to you, is it real or perceived, and in the attempt to digest these factors. And so if you haven't seen this is really hot off the press kind of outcome of our research. We just published a paper in coordination with Group 14 and DU's, I forget what they call it now. Center for Housing and Homelessness Research. But basically it boiled down to this idea of comfort, community, and choice. Like if we context all of our decisions through that with some other goals like dignity and self-esteem or joy and empowerment. If we context all of our design decisions through these things and then enrich that with the context of the community we're working in, through outreach, just asking questions, getting to know the people and the place of projects, that the kinds of outcomes that are available really get enhanced. And the dumb questions that I was good at asking get addressed sooner instead of later. I think architects are really, and commercial real estate in general is really good at the bottom two attributes of Maslow's hierarchy, safety and, here we go into Pechacucha. Safety, physiological needs, but how do you get into love and belonging, self-esteem? And how can the built environment really contribute or have a deleterious effect on that? That's what we're angling at here. And there's real things of that. One of the great things of the Arroyo Village project is the Delores project has this really cool tradition used to where early on guests received quilts that were handmade by volunteers on their first night at the shelter, really as a gesture of welcome and warmth. And as we got to thinking about the architectural expression of the building, the Arroyo ceased to matter so much because we really thought this quilt is potent. It's kind of the program, it's of the people, and it's of the place of Arroyo Village. And so we love this idea of abstracting a quilt onto architecture. This is it in its completed form. This is a view of the northeast corner. You can see the hill. The sky's kind of pretty too. Looking up the hill, I love this shot. It looks like a really urban place. The rail, you know, the rail is a big part of the narrative for this project, and all of the residents enjoy it. We have a funny story about these sunshades. Our structural engineer said it wouldn't work. So we built a mock-up, and the project engineer for ICOTA did chin-ups on it, and we texted it to the structural engineer, and I said, it's working. So they figured out a way to mathematically prove it worked. This is a context looking west, which isn't irrelevant either. I mean, to the west is St. Anthony's and the Federal Center and Lakewood and the Colfax corridor. This is a supportive housing entrance. You know, it's got its own discrete identity and signage and entry features. So this is the final courtyard plan as it developed, and you can really see that the Delores courtyard had a really nice indoor-outdoor attribute to it. As individuals walk in, they're greeted with a warm lobby and immediately this prospect of outdoors. So the idea of being trapped in an institution was abated. And the sense of community is also present just by the comfort of the seating and the materials and the daylight to the south. And then within the courtyard, without getting into too much detail, there's a lot of puddles of space that overlap. So introverted individuals and extroverted individuals can all find their place within the context of the courtyard and the community of the Delores project. This is a supportive housing entrance. So residents there are greeted with a little bit of tile stuff and some art panels and warm tones and textures. People love hanging out in this lobby, and the welcome desk staff are constantly bombarded with all the residents' intrigues. So look down the corridor. You know, we're a big fan of daylight at the end of the corridors at a minimum. You know, to the extent that width can't be afforded, I think daylight really helps. Security and prospect, actually knowing what's at the end of the hallway is important, I think, to consider. And also we just had really small, modest, efficient apartments. You know, there's nothing gratuitous about it, except they're really cute. This is the entrance to the Delores shelter. So a guest to the shelter, this is their first impression. They walk in, screw up the courage to get in through the front door, and they're greeted with this. And so the intake office is that door you can see right to the left, and so there's great visual access, and that staff person can meet that individual in the lobby, and it's dignified. Similar with the dorms, you know, one of the funny things about the dorms was we asked the question of the residents of the shelter, you know, would you like to have the RA office down the hall or something like that? And the residents almost unanimously said, no, we would really like that RA office to be in the dorm. You know, we feel like there's some safety that comes with that, and having that visual access and connection to the Delores staff was a really important piece, similar to the PSH lobby, where the welcome desk really engenders a relationship. Well, the visual cues from the RA office into the dorms was a big deal. Laura and Stacy in our office spent a lot of time finding hardware that locked and unlocked quietly. so that guests who had nighttime jobs or really early jobs or had to be somewhere could do so without disrupting the entire dorm room. And the idea of intimate personal spaces and within the shelter, this is a library adjacent to a little multi-purpose room. We tried to focus on the scale of things. You know, this idea of community around food, and the dining room is on the south-facing side adjacent to that great courtyard. You know, the bathrooms were a big deal. As you can imagine, designing a shelter for a bunch of ladies is probably well beyond my ability. So thank God Stacy was on our team, and really thinking through like what it is to get ready in the morning. So this was, you know, vanities on the right, and then there was kind of makeup stations where women and could help each other out and get ready for the day, and it's actually a place of community, even though it's in the bathroom. And then on the other side of the mirrors is the toilets and showers. So I can't imagine what it's like in the morning. The workforce lobby, you know, same thing. We're trying to create a scale of places where people could hang out and feel comfortable, and that Rocky Mountain communities could program around a sense of community making. This is a classroom actually for the kids programming. I think Rocky Mountain Communities does one of the most impressive children programming programs of operators I've seen. Finish image in the courtyard. So it's kind of the architectural shtick. I don't know if any questions came up, Philip, out of all of that. But if not, I'm done.
I do have one question, and I'm not sure who can best answer it. So Dante and Stephanie, if it's more in your realm, feel free to wait until your presentations and you can tackle this one. But Rose asked how this project is different in concept from the permanent supported housing project that's Greenway Flats in Colorado Springs. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that one or how you're familiar, and if anyone knows how the concepts differ.
I'm not familiar with Greenway Flats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Greenway Flats as well.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, we'll try to figure it out for you, Rose. I do have another question from Diana. Did you incorporate computer labs?
There were computer labs incorporated in all three program spaces. The shelter has 3 or 4 computers that are available to guests. The supportive housing and the workforce sides also have computer stations available to residents.
Okay. Marcel has asked he said the entry to the shelter was really beautiful with some great materials. He's curious how homeless populations feel when they walk in, because they often feel out of place in a fancy place.
So this is Laura with Shopworks, and I actually used to be at the Delores project. Can you mute your? Oh, and sure. Are you guys hearing an echo? So the entryway, that kind of living room feel, was designed a lot with conversations with the guests of the homeless shelter. And that's a key part of kind of all the trauma-informed design research is as it relates to trauma and resilience. I've always been housed, and so my intuition is absolutely wrong when it comes to what folks who've experienced homelessness want and need. And so the first tour of the guests in the shelter, I mean, we were all in tears, and one of the guests at the end said, "I finally don't feel homeless." So to me, you know, it's pretty simple surroundings, you know, it's not ornate with chandeliers. but it has rocking chairs and it really invites people in, and the guests just love it, actually.
Oh, that's great. Alex asked, what discoveries did you make through the community outreach groups?
So we did a lot of work with guests of the shelter as well. And I think a lot of that was us checking our questions. If we'd make a design decision and then go back to the guests and say, how does this feel to you? You know, like having the staff office, you know, really close to the dorms. And they're like, no, we feel safe if staff are looking at us at all times. It's like, oh, okay, that's really different. And then it's little things as well. It's, you know, having a really nice ice machine, because when you've been outside on a hot summer day, I mean, I had 10 people comment to me the first day we moved in over the fact that we now had fancy ice. And, you know, to me, like I can go into air conditioning when I want, you know, and so really being mindful of those things that feel small to me that are really huge for other folks. The other thing that we also found is Delores Project serves a high population of transgender guests, both men and women. And so knowing, for example, that bathrooms are a really triggering place for that specific community, we had a lot of thoughtfulness. That's why the bathroom we really invested time and space in. And now, you know, Stephanie, you know, has shared with me that guests hang out in the bathroom. Like she'll like walk around after dinner and guests are like literally just hanging out at the vanity because they just love being in there. So for me, you know, it's those conversations and also kind of knowing every supportive housing or homeless shelter are serving kind of different subsections of folks experiencing homelessness, and really being mindful to add those extra touches to honor their stories and their experiences so that they can feel safe and grow and learn from there.
Oh, that makes me feel so good. Thank you for sharing that, Laura. I just have a comment from Shelley. I think that folks feel uncomfortable in fancy places because those spaces are predominantly occupied by privileged folks. This is their space, and that's a whole different kind of ballgame because it's occupied by them. And I got a couple of questions from Diana about lessons learned, and I know we're going to circle back to that in later, so I'm going to hold that question. And I've got a question from Alex, which actually might be a good intro to Dante, as we see in this photo that they're showing from the opening. The question is, no, not from Alex, excuse me, this is from Kelly. How long was construction from demo to move in? And that'd be a good place, I think, for Dante to spin off.
No, August, well, because we started pre-demo in June, and then shovels were in ground in August 2017, and we moved in March of 2019. So we had to move some utility lines and such underneath an alley, which is a really fun process. All right, I think Dante's up now.
Dante, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Thanks, Chad and Laura, and hello to everyone. The slide that's up right now is a slide of the ribbon cutting ceremony on July 18th last year. From left to right is Nate Richmond from Blue Line Development, Councilwoman Robin Knich, Britta Fisher, Inspector of Host, Councilwoman Jamie Torres, Gary Dominguez, who was the chair of our board at the time, my colleague and friend, amazing Stephanie Miller, and then, of course, the brand new guy to the far right that made all of this possible within 18 days of being on the job, Dante Latson. So once again, hello, everyone. I want to say shout out to Dick Taft and Terrell Curtis for conceiving of such a project, and to all of those that ensured its completion. Before I share more on the 4 areas listed on this slide, I'd like to give a brief overview of Rocky Mountain Communities, or RMC. Rocky Mountain Communities has been serving families since 1992. RMC's mission is to build brighter futures by investing in resident-focused affordable housing and services, empowering individuals and families to thrive. We currently own 8 properties totaling over 1,100 units, and we manage another 400 or so units through our property management arm, Pillar. We have 2 properties in northern Colorado that would be Fort Morgan and Greeley, 2 properties in Western Slope, Clifton, Colorado, and Grand Junction, and then 4 properties here in the Metro Denver area, including Arroyo Village. So I want to share a little bit about the unit mix. I know that people want to hear about that. I believe that Christian started off with it and sharing in his presentation. We have 130 units. 95 of those units are 1, 2, and 3 bedroom family housing, and 35 apartments for PSH or permanent supportive housing. And of course, TDP or the Delores project has a shelter facility that can accommodate up to 60 beds. And the specific breakdown of units is 35 one-bedroom PSH units, which is about 502 square feet, 25 one-bedrooms at 600 square feet, 58 two-bedrooms at 814 square feet, and then finally 12 three-bedrooms at just over 1,021 square feet. The lease up, and maybe this will tie into a bit of the question, but we will probably get into more of that during the lessons learned. But the lease up began January 30th and was 100% complete by July 31st. There was a comprehensive plan of action, including some preemptive operations that were key factors in the success. And even doing some of these things, it still was not a very easy process. So it was hiring and training an experienced team that understood the vision of the project, outreach and marketing, including DHA, DHS, HUD, VASH, CCH, and other local service providers, a step-by-step application process. We established the criteria that removed barriers to housing. As we got closer to the deadline, we made concessions for rent, half off, or first month's rent during the last 2 months of lease up. And we had some natural delays as a result of construction, but I will say that the last lease signed was on the deadline, July 31st. So needless to say that folks were a little antsy around the office. And I was new to the organization. I just kind of went with the flow, but I now understand better why people were really freaking out about it. Property management, I'll hold that till the end in respect to time. And then, so just a little bit about our services. We offer services that focus on 3 program areas. That's youth, seniors, community, and families. And these services are here to expand residents' educational opportunities, increase their economic security, provide access to health and wellness, and more importantly, build a sense of community. And so I think what most folks are probably more interested in at this point might be how are we managing through providing services and programming during this COVID-19 environment. Our food pantry requests, as you can probably imagine, or even at your own outfits, have increased significantly. Our focus right now is working to get residents signed up for the TRUA program. So Del Norte and Brothers Inc., thanks for the work that you're doing. I know that is not an easy process at all. And then just some of the uncertainty around how do you manage that. So we're looking at alternative methods of delivering those services because while we're in a time where we have to be very careful and cautious, we also recognize for our residents that many of them don't have any outlets. And when you're hearing increases of domestic violence and so forth, it's our responsibility to be creative and think about ways to deliver programming. So right now, we are working with another organization in the community, Youth on Record, to bring the residents of Arroyo Village a community concert that would allow them to have fun, but also be within the guidelines that are suggested at this point for safety. I know that was quick, but any questions for me?
There is a question that came up, but I actually think this might go back to Christian, and I lost it. Do you have information to share on the development and construction costs? And also, were those costs allocated to the 3 projects, and at what levels?
Yeah, and I saw that Ray Stransky asked that. I'm happy to see Ray's name come through. So, yeah, we do have some information to share. The total project cost was just over $34 million, and that included fully funding a reserve to fund supportive services for the 15-year compliance period. So that was about $1.3 million of that $34 million total. I think one of the really innovative things that we were able to do on this project, and I totally geek out on deal structuring and numbers, so this may not be the most interesting thing to other folks, but we were actually able to include all 3 different uses under one financing structure. Even though there were 10 different sources of financing, it was one comprehensive financing structure. So we didn't have to break the shelter out into a separate commercial loan or commercial development budget. We were able to do that because of a provision within the Internal Revenue Code that when you meet 3 specific criteria, you can include facilities like that as a community service facility. And so we were able to include that cost in basis and claim tax credits on that space. And this is really a testament to, the team members that we had on board. And I'm forever grateful to John Peterson and Neil Mahoney at Winthrop and Weinstein, because they're experts at legal structuring, but they really helped us through that process of being able to consider all of this as one financing structure.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions I have right now, and if you want to continue on, Stephanie, with lessons learned.
Actually, it will be just about the Delores project. Yeah, there we go. So I'm Stephanie Miller. I'm the CEO of the Delores project, and I had the great privilege of coming on board after all the brain power, construction, and challenges had occurred. I came on board April 1st of 2019, right at the beginning of lease up of the supportive housing units. So everything was already done. So I just walked in, and so that was a privilege of mine. The Delores Project's mission is to provide inclusive shelter, housing, and supportive services in a caring environment or a caring community, with the vision that all individuals have the community support and resources they need to achieve housing stability. And when we talk about homelessness, it involves a loss of home, community, stability, safety, and social networks. And that is, in fact, what Arroyo Village was really trying to promote. And on top of those ongoing stressors associated with the trauma of homelessness, there's an overwhelming percentage of our guests who experience additional forms of trauma, including physical and sexual abuse, neglect, domestic violence, community violence, and family disruptions. And when we consider trauma-informed care and practices and homelessness intervention at the Delores Project, it includes the physical space and design of the shelter, which Chad had explained as the architectural expression of the environment, trauma-informed design. That is just as important as the strength-based approaches that we take for service provision that prioritizes safety, dignity, and choice. We have 2 distinct services in the shelter. Weekly shelter, we're the only shelter in Denver that offer nights beyond 1 night at a time, pre-COVID days. And extended stay shelter, which is a housing focused shelter, a 6-month program with extensions up to 2 years that's primarily focused on navigation and case management services toward the goal of housing stability. Our case management focuses on addressing immediate pressing needs, such as applying for identification, public benefits, employment linkages to healthcare and treatment as appropriate, as well as housing-focused goals to guide and plan for their exit out of homelessness to permanent housing. The design of the shelter, the trauma-informed design of the shelter has really allowed a smoother transition for Delores Project in our COVID social distancing way of life. We have 2 dorms that are mirror images of each other with 13 bunk beds, and a 3rd dorm, which has 4 bunk beds. And that dorm C, we call it dorm C, has served as a quarantine area for symptomatic guests, as well as we have a single-use bathroom with a shower, toilet, and sink. And that's being used as a quarantine restroom. And so when the design of the shelter was conceptualized, Delores Project could have increased capacity of beds beyond 60 beds, but it was decided to keep it at 60 because we really wanted to have more programming community space. So our library, that there was a picture of earlier, multi-purpose room, in our outdoor fenced-in patio/courtyard area have all served as additional community space for our guests to access and spread out, which has been extremely helpful in our social distancing COVID way of operations. We have expanded to a 24/7 facility since April to really try to promote shelter in place with social distancing. And Laura had mentioned this earlier in terms of our vanity bathroom area, or maybe it was Chad. Vanity bathroom area is also another community space with ample space needed for social distancing. So really, I wasn't at the Delores Project during the conceptualization of the design, but the design and thinking about having a smaller dorm was really helpful when we were doing the whole COVID response plan for the shelter. So that's really what I want to highlight, and somebody had mentioned this earlier, our shelter it's the space does not look like a shelter. When folks walk in, it looks like they're walking into a living room. There is no front desk, intake desk, or staff meet the guests at the door. And there's a private intake office adjacent to the front door, lobby, living room area. And it's really about creating dignified space with choice and where they want to be in the shelter. And I'm mindful of the time, so let me just really highlight the supportive housing portion combines housing assistance with voluntary case managed support services to address the needs of formerly chronically homeless individuals. Services are designed to build independent living with tenancy skills and connect residents with community-based healthcare treatment and employment services. It's 35 units. We have a staff of 7. What's essential is we have 4 staff providing 24/7 coverage of the supportive housing entrance. And we have 2 case managers providing the navigation support services, case management services to our 37 residents in our 35 units, and then a program manager. And we feel like the number 7 staff model really has been pretty instrumental and helpful in really providing the needed services that's necessary to ensure retention in housing. So I will stop there because I know we're short on time.
Great. Just before we go into the lessons learned, I have one question from Kelly just to clarify. Did the Delores project guests not go to the Coliseum during COVID? Did you quarantine on site, right?
We did, right. We were able to refer about 11 of our individuals to protective action. And we did not fill beds as folks left the shelter.
Thank you.
Philip, how are we doing? Should we dive into lessons learned?
Absolutely. I think you've taken some time to answer some questions, and that's put us near the end, but let's get through as many lessons learned. And of course, if folks have to drop off at 3, I will stay on until we get through this and try to follow up with questions at the end as well. But thank you so much.
Great. Well, I'll start on the financing side. And, you know, my lessons learned may sound really intuitive, and they probably are, but, you know, the biggest lesson that I learned, or at least reinforced, is that success really comes through surrounding yourself with the best people possible and people of integrity. And I think that starts with the people that are on this panel, you know, Stephanie and Dante, their predecessors and their boards, their ability to envision all of this and then stick with it for the better part of 6 years is really incredible. And they had the fortitude and the leadership to sit through some really difficult conversations as this project evolved. And there were plenty of really, really difficult conversations. And I think it ultimately led to a really incredible building. And then, you know, Chad and Laura and their leadership in the design and entitlement, and really creating a culture of success around this building. You know, those two were, I think, most instrumental in really setting the tone for the development team and having a collaborative process, and having really honest conversations, even if they weren't easy. So, you know, I'm forever grateful to these panelists and then, you know, all of our other project team members that saw this vision and said, yeah, we can get on board with that. Starting with Chaffa, who said, yeah, we can see this becoming a reality. And I don't think most state agencies would get on board with that. You know, you think about the complications that we ran into with providing services on site and fully funding those services for 15 years, unwinding 27 units from an existing LURA to redevelop the site, having 2 different owners of 2 different sites with different zoning and executing 2 different land leases to a single partnership, you know, including a $3 million supportive or homeless shelter into basis of the project. Any one of these things on their own would create a really complicated project. And we were able to overcome all of those. You know, I mentioned John Peterson and Neil Mahoney earlier, and they're not just attorneys, but they're great people. And they saw this through with us. Our financing partners, I think Anthea Martin is on the line. She was the originator for the perm loan. She was a champion of this project. Boston Capital, Sugar Creek Capital, their respective legal teams, you know, everybody viewed this project and said, we can get on board with that and we're going to see this through to the end. And I think that took a lot of fortitude and integrity to get that done. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the city of Denver and DOLA. I'm sitting here looking at my list. It's hard to keep up with 10 different financing sources, but I want to make clear that they were heavily involved as well. That's all I got.
I can talk a little bit about the design lessons learned. I think one is I just always get reminded that humility is the best way to lead, because, man, this was a hard one, just getting into the target zone and on all of these moving pieces that Christian just described. I'll also say that a really important team member that Christian forgot is Icota. Icota Construction was, I mean, without them, the project wouldn't happen. You know, they were committed to making it work. They helped us figure out a path to hit the budget, and they were committed 100% all the way through. So I think we were fortunate to find them along the way, and also our group of engineers, I kind of echo that same set of sentiments. Like, we really had a terrific consulting team helping us debug these complications, and I think they really saw this as a special project, and that rendered itself in the outcomes. So I'll stop there. There's a ton of other things that we screwed up. You can always call me.
Stephanie, I believe you're up next.
Gotta unmute. I think lessons learned, really prioritizing creative ways to engage all three elements of the community into programming, because we have found that we can get so busy in our own respective programs, shelter, supportive housing, workforce housing, that we may lose sight of the entire community. So really prioritizing creative ways to engage community members. We've tried to do that by having, like, we had a Halloween party. We are scheduled to have a concert in the courtyard. I believe it's in the next, well, it was scheduled for later this month. Next month. I'm not quite sure if it's being postponed, but you know, really highlighting that to get community members involved in their own community. But it is really, I think, the responsibility of RMC and the Delores Project staff to get that going. And Dante, you want to talk about working together, and then we'll end with security?
Sure. I would just say that to piggyback on that, we recognize that it's the residents and staff, they're the ones who are going to define the community. So if we had to do it all over again, we understand that you have to be intentional about that, creating that process and that community that you want. And we would have brought a services person on from the very beginning, not after the lease up, but from the very beginning to help create that. The other piece is that you have two organizations who do really good work in the community, but do it differently and population slightly different. And I think that maybe we didn't take that into, or we didn't think about that as much. And with that being said, it's very important to hire those consultants around the physical environment and creating that so that the teams can learn to work together. But working together, onto what Stephanie mentioned, we now have weekly inter-staff meetings. There's a monthly monthly meeting between Stephanie and I. And the other piece is, we may even go into some restorative justice work here, because it's important not just for our staff, but the folks who we're serving. And I'll just leave you with this: it's a journey. And remember to just be intentional about creating that space and to stay the course. There are challenges, but it's worth it.
I just want to highlight in terms of for supportive housing, since that is property managed by RMC, service provision provided by Delores Project, and it's all about trying to have residents retained in their housing. So if there's any kind of violations or any issues, you know, it's having those weekly meetings between our staff is really important in terms of how to address some of those problem areas to prevent evictions or violations from happening. So really just maintaining that open lines of communication.
Mm-hmm. In terms of security, we had to go with underground parking, and there were, some challenges with that because the location is a transit-oriented development. It brings with it some unique challenges around parking, walkability, and safety. So we had a reduced parking ratio, which was approved to discourage the dependence on the car. and the city's solution was bike sharing and car sharing. But the market conditions changed, as you all may know. So with the increase in use of Uber and Lyft, our car sharing programs and bike sharing programs failed. We also purchased 15 bikes for a property managed bike sharing program, and within 1 month, we had 10 out of those 15 bikes walk away. But I think the other piece of it around design is that, you know, with the goal of being an active and resilient community, thinking about the staircases, we wanted to encourage people to be active and residents to walk to and from the light rail. The southeast stairs were intended to be a feature of the active community. But what we didn't necessarily anticipate was some of the activities that take place at some of the TOD stations, the number of marginalized folks who are living in the open spaces near the light rail, and some of the breaches taking place there. So we've had to look at some additional upgrades. And so, you know, if you are looking at such a property, just be prepared for, you know, some of those funds in your contingency. Stephanie, anything else you would add for security?
I just throw in that, to me, security is, there's a real security and there's a perceived security, and they're both equally important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it's about finding that mix, you know, that balance rather. I believe that's it from us.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I will point out, as you see in your screen right now, they have shared their contact information. So if you have specific questions, you can reach out to them individually. I've already gotten their permission. I also can let you know that Laura has shared with me that she's going to share the research from their trauma-informed design. So when I do send out that follow-up link, it will include a link to the recording, the slides that you're looking at, as well as the research that Laura is going to add to that. I do also want to add some things I should have pointed out right at the beginning. Our Eagle Awards, as I mentioned, are coming up on July 30th. And Arroyo Village is a nominee for those awards, and we currently have voting for People's Choice Award open. So if you'd like to check out the other nominees as well as vote for who you think has done the best job this year, check it out on our website. And of course, thank you to our sponsor, Wells Fargo, who makes all of these webinars possible. My name again is Philip Enmark. You can reach me at philip@housingcolorado.org if you have any other questions or anything else. And thank you all again. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.